Kia ora e te whānau. Welcome to this week's episode of Raw Politics. And what a week it has been in politics, both in the Beehive in Wellington and across the Pacific Ocean in Tonga, where both the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister have been at the Pacific Islands Forum. Like I say, there has been a lot going on this week, and we will do our best in our weekly chat about the big political issues to pull it all together for you, hopefully give you something to think about and throw forwards on the implications of what these people say. I am Newsroom political editor Laura Walters, and joining me in the Wellington studio is senior political reporter Marc Daalder, and with us in Auckland is Newsroom co-editor Tim Murphy. How are we both doing this week?
Oh, I think we face a sort of a blizzard of political developments and news at the moment. I stepped back yesterday and was thinking, with the Pacific Forum, foreign affairs, climate issues. We're talking about sovereignty and the treaty. We're talking about legal action in the High Court in terms of the Greens. It was all coming at us this week. And on top of that, there's all the business stuff they're doing as well, such as the infrastructure and the energy policy and the fast track. There's a whole lot coming down the track. And I pity the gallery, you guys, for all that you've got to get your arms around every day.
Yeah, and I pity us trying to distill it into something like a 20 to 30 minute episode, so we'll see how we go with that.
And probably more on the 30-minute side based on past sort of precedent.
On that, let's try and boil it down to a few main topics today, because there is so much we could cover, like you say, Tim. But I think we're going to focus on three main things. Firstly, this government's approach to development or nation building, this PM's approach to the cabinet manual, and Winston Peters' strange obsession with Sir Apirana Ngata. And to wrap up, we will be, as always, offering you some recommendations. This government is obsessed with development, and development on a big scale. We know that they want to build big, they want to build fast, and they want to build for the future. Of course, there is the fast-track legislation that we've all been following incredibly closely and the developments that have been happening there. But beyond that, this week we've seen a lot in terms of infrastructure with the Infrastructure Agency and the nation-building conference that's been going on in Auckland. And then we've also got some big energy announcements as well. And it all kind of speaks to this desire to, push for economic growth, push for big infrastructure builds and development in that space. I'm interested in your thoughts both on the government's approach to development and whether they're taking the right approach, especially in the pace at which they're moving. Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I think the distinction this government against the last one is the pace and the decision that any sort of protocols or orthodoxies that have held up pace need to be put aside, because Labor would say to you that they were a development government and development was a very big thing for them. Infrastructure, they would say, was huge on their agenda with, say, the Auckland light rail project and the Lake Onslow energy storage concept, that they had these very big ideas and very big plans. But how National will differentiate all of this is that they didn't have anything going and doing and happening, and nothing was being achieved. And that's what National's pace theme comes from, I think. It is quite remarkable how much this government is doing in this area, or starting to do. Again, they haven't done anything. But, if you listed them all across energy and across the infrastructure supply or chain, as they call it, and put them all down to big lists, it's very substantial. And it's happening simultaneous, multiple ministers working on these things and daily and weekly coming out with updates. So I think their whole theme of pace, the criticism will be, if you go too fast, is it pace or is it hastiness? And, haste is always fraught with risk, and it could well come back on the environmental side, on the cost side, and all sorts of areas where they might just go too fast.
Yeah, and I think on that point, and we've kind of seen that recognition of it from this government, that potentially the speed or even the perception of speed or haste has been something that they've gotten a lot of criticism over. And we saw on Sunday Chris Bishop and Shane Jones come out and announce some adjustments to the fast track legislation, which is kind of, that flagship piece of legislation or policy that's driving a lot of this development and, at pace, as the name would suggest with fast track. But they've clearly listened to a lot of the criticism there that, we don't want ministers to have final say, that it should be an expert panel with the right people. Who that is and how they're chosen is still something where, we're trying to work through the details on that. But there's almost been this kind of soft shift or launch of a new name for that legislation where they're moving from fast track to, at the moment, they're referring to it, at least in the House, as the one-stop shop fast track legislation. And I imagine in time it's just going to become the one-stop shop bill or act that we're going to see there, where I think they're finally starting to understand that, the criticism around the speed and the haste and the kind of riding roughshod over process and checks and balances and things like that.
But the change announced the other day, and Mark, you'll have a better fix on this, in not allowing ministers to make the final call, but putting it through the expert panel for deliberation. That won't make it any slower, will it? It's not going to slow things down, really. It's just going to remove the political element, I think. So I think even the changes they've made, Laura, don't slow down the fast track much at all. Would that be right, Mark?
Yeah, I think the question is, why is it hard to build things in New Zealand, right? And the fast track bill seemed to have many different answers to that question that it was trying to solve. I don't know that giving one person or a small number of people the ability to push projects through at will is the solution to the problem of it being difficult to build things in New Zealand. The one-stop shop idea makes a bit more sense, right? It says there's a lot of regulatory red tape. There are a lot of different acts that apply when you're trying to do something. If you just go through this one process and we streamline that process, you can still do all those checks, but it's not applying for a building consent and a resource consent and an EEZ this and conservation that, trying to put it together into one bundle. That's one of the things. But there is other sort of issues around supply chains, around workforce, around cost of materials, around just New Zealand not being a very large country and therefore it being difficult to get the kind of capital and have the balance sheets you need to be making these big investments. The other thing I'll say is, in terms of that building for the future idea, Chris Bishop has come out, and I like this article by Dan Brunskill in Interest this week, saying, I want a bipartisan approach to infrastructure. But he's done that after spending the last 10 months cancelling every infrastructure project that Labour had been working on. And the reality is, part of the reason for being so hasty for this government is a recognition that if they don't get the shovels in the ground, Labour's just going to come in and cancel everything they're trying to do as well. So that's one of the problems that we face in terms of getting things built. And I don't think the easy line of we should just be bipartisan on this. And by the way, bipartisan means you guys agree with what I want to do and vice versa. It is actually going to get us anywhere.
Yeah, and I think then that speaks to some other work they're doing, because this is bigger than just the fast track legislation, right? Like the infrastructure agency and the works that Chris Bishop is doing in that space where they are able to look at things over a long period. That 30-year pipeline have an agency that brings in the money and then the commission that has a look in kind of an independent way, looks at the business case, suggests what's going to work and what's not, and maybe get consensus on both sides.
And I think that's the difficulty with the politicians leading on the big infrastructure things, right? It's people want to have a legacy. You look at light rail in Auckland, they were presented with two options, the underground and the above ground option. And the underground one was, $3 or $5 billion. And the above ground one was $3 or $5 billion. And the underground one was 4 or 5 times that much. And of course, they went with a really big, expensive one to look like they're doing things, when actually, it's getting things built is not just about building the most impressive thing. It's about building something that works and that's useful. Same, ditto for the Wellington Long Tunnel, which this government has come around and proposed, a big tunnel that takes you from the terrace to the airport, basically. And you go, okay, really? This is the solution that our brightest minds have come up with? No, this is the solution that our ministerial minds have come up with so that it can, someday say the Simeon Brown tunnel
Simeon Brown's big hole.
Simeon Brown's long tunnel. Sure. And in future generations, people thank Simeon Brown for building this big piece of infrastructure.
It's good in a campaign. Is it good in practice? And to your point earlier, Tim, does it ever actually get done? Or is it just business case and feasibility plans? Like we're stuck in the Australian Utopia TV show.
Well, there's a degree of bipartisanship already, almost by default. As Jonathan Milne, our Newsroom Pro editor, wrote this week, that Ropainga, which is the delivery agency that Grant Robertson created for infrastructure out of the Christchurch Recovery Agency. So they turned that into a sort of an organisation that could take on infrastructure development that the small ministries and agencies of government didn't have any expertise in. And this government has taken that and given it a big push. So that's one element that by default, perhaps, we have a sort of a continuum. The Infrastructure Commission that was formed under the last lot is going on. So they've got the sort of the most basic building blocks there. I go back, though, to 1992. A very good journalist named David McLaughlin wrote a book about New Zealand's decay already then, and he called it The Undeveloping Nation, that so little was being spent on all our infrastructure by councils and by government that we were basically going backwards towards the third world then. And no one's going to tell you that a whole lot, apart from roads, I think, has been done in any of the areas we needed to work on. So if this government and Labor and the Greens and others can get even the most basic building blocks towards the next 30 years, then it's got to be good.
And we talk about roads. I think we all think about roads and transport projects when we're talking infrastructure, but of course it's bigger than that. It includes, we're in this issue with a energy uncertainty at the moment. And so there's a lot of discussion around energy infrastructure and what that means for the future. And I saw James Shaw kind of talking about that this week in some articles where, we're building these long-term projects to deal with issues right now. Is that the right approach? And I know that, Marc, you've written obviously a lot about energy and the plans for the future. What do you think about this government's view to developing in that space?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we tend not to think, our heads don't immediately go to energy on infrastructures because it's not something government necessarily builds, at least on the generation side. Yes, the gentailers are half state owned, but they operate like private companies. And so they, all this renewable electricity infrastructure that the government wants to see built, that's going to be done by private companies, maybe taking advantage of the fast track process. We'll see how that goes. Although there's for the companies that have the most kind of green credentials in mind, there's a reluctance to be using that scheme because of the worry that they might be seen as greenwashing and covering for all these kind of environmentally destructive things that might go through fast track as well. So the offshore wind industry, for example, a lot of them are saying, we've got a big social license problem we need to get through anyways to be building these big turbines, particularly off the coast of Taranaki. Working with iwi, the last thing we want to do is be going through the fast track process. You've also got the LNG kind of import facility that the government has announced. It will, if the sector can kind of get together and agree on how they might put this project together, the government will legislate a consent for it, which again maybe is more that kind of perspective of infrastructure that we're used to, where the government really is getting in very hands-on. Maybe they're not building it, maybe they're not owning it, but they're going to pass a law to say you can build this kind of wherever you want. Yeah,
it's a strong signal and enabling of doing that.
Yeah.
Marc, can I ask a question of you on energy about the politicking going on here? I'm confused, and I think the public probably are. The current government says our shortages that we're having this year, which we all know are because of too little rain and sun and wind, but they say it's also because the last government banned gas exploration, right? That's an easy, possibly trite line, but isn't it the case that it takes forever to find the gas and get it out, and that even if people had continued and been exploring after Labor's ban had been mooted and come in, that nothing would be ready now anyway? Aren't we really here just trying to put a political spin on sort of a long-term problem that isn't got an easy answer.
Surely not, Tim. No politician would ever do that.
No, this is infrastructure. We're bipartisan on it. It is effectively impossible for a company to have applied and gotten an exploration permit in 2018 had the ban not come into effect, done their surveying, found gas, done all the infrastructure to actually begin producing it and get it to market by now, 6 years later. So it was a very small sample size, but the shortest it's ever taken for that process is 10 years. The average for offshore in New Zealand is 16 years. So the ban has not prevented, in that sense, any gas that might have otherwise come. The government's other argument is, it's actually depressed broader investment intentions, People aren't going into their existing wells, which aren't banned, but they're just not putting the money into producing more. It's not quite true either. There have been 2 big wellheads drilled offshore in existing permit areas with big hopes of finding gas, and they just haven't. And as it turns out, since the start of the century, we've had 1, maybe 2 big fossil fuel finds offshore in Taranaki. So, there's this sense that the government would like to create that there's this vast natural resource sitting out there and labor has tied our hands. The truth is probably there's not a lot out there. It's really costly to get out. And now, even without the ban, even without the politics of it, a company that wants to come in and invest hundreds of millions of dollars into producing gas needs to have confidence that they'll still be selling it to someone in 20 or 30 years' time. And the way, the global transition away from fossil fuels is going is it just doesn't seem that that's very likely.
I would wager that every government that has ever been formed in New Zealand has had to deal with some ministers behaving badly. Sometimes they just can't help themselves. The interesting bit usually comes with how a Prime Minister deals with those ministers after they've spoken out of turn. And we have a lot to discuss in this space this week. We've had Paul Goldsmith, who's been talking to the seafood industry on the Marine and Coastal Areas Act, kind of foreshadowing the decisions that Cabinet might make ahead of Cabinet making any actual decisions. He went so far as to, he eventually admitted, make up the number that might only apply to 5% of the coastline. We had Shane Jones again, even after being told not to, trying to undermine the judiciary, saying that a judge was a communist. And then we've had Winston Peters, who is the Deputy Prime Minister, but at times in the past couple of weeks has also been the Acting Prime Minister, just going rogue as he's wont to do by denying that climate change is man-made, and last week diverting from Christopher Luxon's position on the treaty principles bill, completely muddying the waters in that space. So there are a lot of ministers just kind of doing the things that they want to do and not really staying along government lines. How do you think, Tim, that Christopher Luxon is dealing with all of this?
I get the impression that he's almost been, he's almost in the Stockholm syndrome, where he's come to love his coalition partners so much that anything goes. And look, we all know that he can't push back or smack down too hard against Winston, certainly, Seymour as well, but their ministers as well seem to get a very soft touch. All prime ministers try not to be too constricting of their ministers and what they can say and how they behave, but just go back to 2 of the very, very good ones, Key and Clark. They would front things and address them, and they'd win kudos internally from their caucuses and partners and from the public, I think, by just making a call and saying, well, that one, no, I think it's gone too far and the minister will do X or Y. I truly think that Luxon has probably been moved to a more laissez-faire position than he might have expected himself to be as a Prime Minister, that he is allowing more and more to go because he doesn't want to be seen to have division or conflict within this 3-party group. And some of the things that, they're almost, you wouldn't even think twice about saying they're not right, such as a minister calling a High Court judge a communist. Now, the dancing on the head of the pin by the research unit and the Prime Minister's office and himself and saying, well, she was a member of the Socialist Action Party in the 70s or 80s or something, is laughable, really. The wall came down in 89, team. The Cold War finished. And no one anywhere is calling each other communists unless they are trying to be pejorative. And, so I think that, and the reaction this week from the Bar Association saying, look, this needs to be looked at. There actually is no cause here for inaction. It'll just encourage it. And I think they need to pause and look at that. And he really does need to pull back a bit for his ministers.
And this wasn't a one-off, from Shane Jones. He's done this before. David Seymour's done it before. Mark, you've written about how Judith Collins, as the Attorney General, has actually told them to pull their heads in. And the fact that then they're just kind of shrugging it off and go, I don't care, we're going to do it again anyway. It almost feels like Christopher Luxon does need to show that they're serious when they say they need to stay in line, especially in terms of criticising the judiciary. I also think it's interesting his approach to when he feels like ministers are underperforming versus his approach to when ministers are speaking out of turn or kind of stepping out of line. I mean, we'll all remember that he was pretty quick to sack Melissa Lee from the media and communications portfolio when she wasn't getting the job done there. And he said, that's just how I roll. And everyone thought, okay, he moved on that pretty quickly. Whereas with this, he doesn't seem to be pulling his ministers back into line. And I take your point on ACT in New Zealand First, but even with Paul Goldsmith, after many questions, Goldsmith eventually said, yes, I have had a discussion with the Prime Minister. Said, well, did he bring up the Cabinet Manual with you? No, of course he didn't. He just wanted to know exactly what I said. So the fact that he didn't even reprimand him and remind him of his duties in terms of the Cabinet Manual and not breaching that confidentiality or foreshadowing decisions that Cabinet might make, it raises questions there.
I think,
but it's not against the Cabinet Manual to make things up, is it? Otherwise, we'd never go a day. We'd never get through a one sort of sitting.
Yeah,
I think the in theory, the Goldsmith Cabinet Manual issue is around talking about a decision before it's gone through Cabinet. The one caveat or note that's worth making is the Shane Jones communist judge thing apparently happened prior to Judith Collins writing that letter to him. We've only learned about it subsequent, but. Do we think that he wouldn't have done it yesterday if he had had the opportunity? Probably not. I'm interested, in that distinction that you've made between how Luxon responds to, I think, what he considers a substantive issue with a minister who's failed in a policy area, versus this sort of thing, which it just is clear that he doesn't think it matters all that much, right? If it was actually important to him, he's shown he can reprimand someone, he can deal out consequences. We know that he has that in him. So when at least you're dealing with a national minister like Paul Goldsmith, the only reasoning for not doing that is, I don't think that what you've done is particularly substantively important. It sounds a lot more like the media is just upset about something and it's just rhetoric and image. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it could be that. Also, to Tim's point, it could be around unity and things like that. And maybe there are discussions that happen in the background that they don't tell us about. I doubt that that's the case, but that want to keep unity, so not telling people that they're doing the wrong thing there. And I think kind of just picking up on a point you're making around, media rhetoric. I mean, last week, speaking as the Prime Minister, Winston Peters, muddied the waters around the government's position on the Treaty Principles Bill. Christopher Luxon's been incredibly clear. We will support it, pass first reading to the Select Committee, not beyond that. No matter how many times he's been asked, how many ways he's been asked, no, we will not vote for it at second reading. We've been very clear on that. That's what was, agreed through the coalition negotiations. And then Winston Peters stands up as acting Prime Minister in the House and answers a question saying, hey, look, if the facts change, we'll change our minds. And completely, went astray of the position, muddied the waters. When Christopher Luxon was asked about that and whether he had spoken to Winston Peters, he shrugged it off as a Beltway bubble issue. It's a very important issue. Everyone wants to, know what the government's position is on this. And he just said, oh, this is just a Beltway bubble issue. So maybe his radar on understanding what is important and what is not is a bit off there.
And also, as a person who, regularly misspeaks and probably says too much and lets things go and has to sort of walk them back, perhaps he's got more empathy with ministers who might be at a dinner with the, whatever group that was, fishing industry, and say, 5%, and that's just a made up number. He meant not much, So maybe that's that kind of thing. But we should bear in mind that the great shrugger, the great prime ministerial, I'm very relaxed about this, being John Key, who'd always say, well, I'm pretty relaxed, or at the end of the day, I'm quite relaxed on that. Even Key would act on these kinds of things and just bring it into line and keep a kind of professional, constitutionally kind of straight operation going. I was struck this week in the House, one element that came up with this government. They were being questioned, the ACT Minister, Workplace Minister Brooke van Velden, over the Uber Court of Appeal decision about whether Uber drivers are contractors or employees. And the Court of Appeal ruled that they are effectively employees. And that's a win for the workers, not for the other side of things. And so ACT and this government is going to make a change to change that rule to stop that being the case. And when they were quizzed about it, they said, oh, no, we can't possibly talk about our plans or what we might do because this is still before the courts. Now, the exact same things happened, of course, at the Marine and Coastal Areas Act, where the Court of Appeals made a judgment, and they're not waiting for that whole court process to possibly work its way to the Supreme Court. They're saying, no, we're acting on this now. This is a wrong interpretation of wrong about what Parliament said and so on. So when it suits, the government will respect the rule of law and the processes, the legalities of the courtroom. When it doesn't, they kind of just go their way. There's got to be a bit more coherence and cohesiveness on this stuff.
Tim, I'm curious about the judiciary stuff in particular, because it feels like the way that David Seymour and Shane Jones in particular talk about the judiciary. We've got the treaty, the Waitangi Tribunal comments. We've got this communist judge issue. We've got Shane Jones's previous comments about the Supreme Court and the Mike Smith decision. It's very, very, very feels to me very, very unique in how ministers talk about the judiciary, that even the past discretions that we can think about, like Stuart Nash going on the radio and saying, he hopes a person who shot a cop gets a long prison sentence, like the substance of that is not particularly controversial, but he is technically kind of commenting on a potential judicial decision, and he loses his job for that. So with your longer view, is this unusual, or is it, par for the course from some ministers?
Oh, I think it's highly unusual, but it's a victim of the age in some ways, that undermining or at least removing protocols and orthodoxies and old-fashioned kind of traditions, as some might see it, is that thing that's come out of the States, where you just don't observe all the niceties and protocols, the manners, or the kind of the diplomacy. And so Shane Jones is pushing away, nudging. Each push means the next time won't be as unprecedented and won't be as unknown. And so each time he does it, it makes the next time a bit easier for himself or someone else. Same with David Seymour. I think these things are seen as perhaps irritating, academic, just kind of principles and protocols that get in the way of robust decision-making or robust kind of reversals of things they don't agree with. So it's much more common, and it's unprecedented perhaps in that it's not being reined in.
But it does feel like it's part of that general just chipping away at, the integrity of institutions, which is obviously going to have a really negative impact in the long term. Our audience question for the week is, why is Winston Peters so obsessed with Sir Apirana Ngata? Now, Tim, we often throw to you as our resident Peters expert. What do you reckon? Why does he keep invoking Apirana Ngata?
Well, he does, and it comes up every time he's speaking of late in the House, answering questions, speeches. Most recently, it's coming up because of Ngāta's view on whether Māori in the treaty ceded sovereignty to the Crown. And Ngāta had a view that they did cede sovereignty to the Crown. Peters ascribes to that view. He sees all the most recent research and the other experts along the way since the 1920s, 30s that he's quoting. He sees these as sort of Johnny-come-lately, uninformed, ungentlemanly, unworldly of that time, and stretches back to saying that, you know, Ngāta even knew people who were there at the time from a generation. He would have known old people who were there when it was signed. But Peters has had this in his head for years. He's been holding up Aparana Ngāta's little booklet on the treaty in elections past and campaigns past. Views him, I think, a bit like himself, a grand Māori man of politics, certainly recognises his sort of legal background and his parliamentary longevity, and so cites him as someone who possibly he aspires to be remembered as in the same vein.
And while the discussion around this came up through the Treaty Principles Bill, whether or not Māori ceded sovereignty, he's weirdly speaking about Ngāta in terms of climate change as well, Mark. Can you give us a bit of a rundown on how on earth we ended up there?
I think that was maybe a bit more of the result of a joke where having, this precedent established over the past couple of weeks, as Tim has noted, when he was standing up to take a question on the climate change comments that he's been making recently. Kieran McAnulty shouted out, well, what did Ngāta say about this? And Winston launched into a diversion about how Māori never lived near the shore because of sea level rise and tsunamis, and they never lived in Christchurch anywhere where the earthquake did damage in 2011, and Ngāta was involved in that in some way, presumably being Māori from a previous time.
Yeah, it's absolutely bizarre, isn't it, though? And he's got, I imagine, he's got a kind of a collection of people that he talks about. I mean, it's Ngāta this week, but he also constantly refers to Dame Whina Cooper and others, to your point, Tim, people of the past who have been much celebrated by our country. They must know best, whatever they think stands, and, we can't move forwards or change our minds from there, apparently.
It feels a little bit
I'm waiting for him to look across at the Māori Party and say to them, I knew Dame Whina Cooper, and you are no Whina Cooper. Because this is what it's building to. It's this whole, I've got heritage, I've got the long links back to the great Māori, you're up-and-coming radicals who are just, misconstruing things for your own purposes.
It does also feel maybe a little bit like an American style of politics of calling back to the founding fathers, to these, particular individuals in a culture in America, a political culture that is very much about the individual, whereas in New Zealand, more and more, but not as much as in America. It's much easier to refer to, policies and eras than particular prime ministers from the past. But Winston does find this to be a useful kind of rhetorical device, is to say these are people, who have mana, and I can kind of use that to enhance my point.
Makes sense for a populist politician.
Yeah.
And it should be pointed out that Ngāta was a scholar and hugely connected and informed on things Māori, but that the scholarship since then, including the Waitangi Tribunal in 2014 and others, have found the opposite, that in the reading of the treaty that they take a different view, and almost all scholars take that other view, not his.
To quote Winston Peters from last week, when the facts change, we change our mind.
And to be fair, things do change over time, right? These are people of their time, and they had positions and views and accomplished things that were very progressive for their time. But we're 100 years on now, 102, as Winston will be keen to remind you.
Let's wrap things up, as always, with some recommendations. The best thing you have watched, read, or listened to this week. Tim, what have you got for us?
I'm nominating a story on RNZ by Annika Smith, who'd covered the court case involving a unnamed political figure who was convicted this week for historic sex abuse charges. She went and spoke to a wife of a victim who was able to show and demonstrate to her that concerns about this individual had been raised with the party and its leader months before the person stepped down. It's a very interesting story for widening perhaps that coming political scandal.
Cool. And Mark, what have you got for us?
I'm recommending your eagle-eyed spotting of a last-minute change, a big last-minute change in the government's gangs legislation, which kind of expands the powers that they will have to go into homes and figure out if people are members of gangs in their homes. Read the story; it'll fill you in on the details.
Great. And I have a piece from One News from Benedict Collins, who really digs into some data, some cherry-picked data, if you will, from Labour Party police spokesperson Ginny Anderson. She was talking about police foot patrols having gone down during this government's time, but it didn't take long for Benedict Collins from One News to show her why her data wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. And rather than back down and apologise and right the record, she dug in. And I think it's a really well put together piece that shows how important it is to understand the context around pieces of data like this. That's it from the Raw Politics team for this week. Thank you so much to our producer, Trent Doyle, and to all of our listeners, readers and viewers. If you have any burning questions, send them to me at laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us here next week on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.